Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about code reviews. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do you keep code reviews from taking forever? Well, you either make them small, like you try to favor small commits and small changes so the review itself doesn't take longer, but then there is another approach that I think is more sustainable, and that is to think in terms of frameworks of doing things, like make investments into developing frameworks of work, so the amount of changes that are necessary as part of the work is as small as possible. These, what I would say, are the two main ones. Let me kind of walk through that. So first and foremost, I think that's should feel obvious. If you have smaller commits, then the code review itself should not take as long. But then again, if you're dealing with people who don't really know what they're doing, or you might have people who like this is something that, as a rule, you should be following this to try to make contributions as small as possible, but at the same time it's difficult for you to always influence this because it's a bit of a philosophical thing for a lot of people. Some people want to work forever in the same branch and then make really big commits, and then the code review takes a long time. Mentally it's draining for the person who's going to do the review. But then again, if you ask them to do small commits or small reviews, you get other sorts of overhead. The way that I try to explain it is that if you're going to move a ton of dirt from one place to another, you can make the decision on how to move it, but the dirt mound is the dirt mound. Like, this is how much work there is. So you can either have many small boxes that the dirt is moved, like the thing is going to be moved in, or you can have bigger boxes, but it's still the same amount of work. So cognitively, it's been proven more than a few times that it's a good idea to reduce the commit and the review size as much as possible. But as I said, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes mistakes are made and so forth and so forth. But as a rule, try to follow that. The other thing that I think is underestimated many times is the claim I made to think in terms of frameworks. What I mean by that is not like a framework that you necessarily buy from, or not buy, but not like a standard framework as we think about them. Like in front end, that would be like React, Angular, Vue, etc., etc. In back end, it would be like whatever web framework you're using on the server. I'm more suggesting that you think in terms of frameworks of work. When you learn the patterns that you follow when you do your development work, it's good for you to invest in abstractions that make the boilerplate stuff that you do as low risk as possible and as trivial as possible. So examples of that would have been, if you are making a lot of network calls to external systems, it's good for you to invest in some type of basic abstraction for making network calls, like a REST client or something like that. And then the changes that you have to make they're usually very small, because if you do the abstraction correctly, you only have to provide like basically input parameters to whatever client you're using in order to fetch those things, right? And then for another example would be if you're doing styling or things like that, it's a good idea for you to invest in setting up like basic styles. So for example, with CSS, that you don't duplicate things over and over. Ideally, you should try as much as possible to dumb down or reduce the surface area of the code that you have to change as much as possible, because what then happens is that the review itself, and it does, you don't have to do as much coding, if that makes sense. The less code you have to write, the better for you. But this is a bit of a balancing act, because if you're making the wrong sort of abstractions, you're actually going to cause a lot of bugs and issues and so forth. So for me, it's a two-parter. One part is, as I said, make the changes that you have to make as small as possible, but you also have to enable yourself to work more effectively so that you don't have to make these because if you're writing a lot of software and you keep on repeating that process for long enough, there is another problem that comes, which is not just the sheer quantity that you have to review. It is how likely is the change that you made going to cause an issue, and how much investment does the person who's reading the code have to cognitively make. Because an example would be, you can make a very small contribution in an area, but if the surrounding code is very complicated, then it might be very difficult for the reviewer to actually get a full picture of what is the impact of this thing. This is sort of the idea of unit testing, because if you have unit tests and they are passing, then me as the person who's reviewing your code, I don't have to worry as much that I have to see if I can find a bug with the thing you just did, because if the test cases are there and I can see that the tests are well made, then it's easier for me to comprehend what you're trying to do. It's also likelier for me to figure out, do you have any, like if I look at the code that you've made, it's not that much code, and I see the test that you have made on the system, and I see that they cover the cases that I can think of, then I feel safe in that, yeah, then this is probably going to be a safe change. But on the other hand, if we have like a really seriously big legacy system with a lot of complexity, and you make a change and you add a few tests to that interface, it might be hard for me to figure out, does this actually cover all the cases for what could go wrong? And so now I have to actually spend a lot of energy figuring out, well, I'm gonna give you a secret, guys. The average software developer is not going to do this, because they're going to look at it as, yeah, this looks good enough, and then they're going to ship it, because they know that if there's a problem in production when we ship that thing, it's going to be on you, if anyone, because as the reviewer, in practice as the reviewer, you're never going to be held almost ever accountable for issues and stuff like that. And I actually test for that sometimes, so I know that some reviewers they just click approve, like they don't really review things, and that is a pattern that is almost impossible to stop. But it is it is there. So if you want to help people, one part actually spending less time on reviewing, but also feel fairly confident in that the review was actually a good one, the simpler you can make your work process, the better for you and everybody else. So what I want you to take away from this is that keeping code reviews from taking forever is usually like it's as simple, quote-unquote, as trying to reduce the amount of code that you are merging at any given time, because the smaller you can make the merges, the less code there is for you to look through. It's still the same amount of work, so you're sort of trading the cognitive load, which is the thing that you should be optimizing for, I argue, because build times and like automation and so forth, these are things that might take time for deploying and so forth, but these things you can affect to a fairly large degree, and technically waiting for something to be done, quote unquote, that still unblocks the human from doing other stuff. But I've talked to people who like basically make that motivation. I prefer bigger commits because the builds take longer, and I go, yes, but the correctness of the code and the human who's trying to help you check that correctness with the review is more important, I will argue, because if you force people to do a lot of code reviews and like a large amount of code, odds are that things are going to slip through, and the scope of the problem and test area and all that good stuff, it goes up by quite a lot. So it's easier if you just keep things smaller and take that overhead of moving smaller boxes versus larger boxes. But as I said, try to simplify your work as much as possible, because code reviews, example, if you have a really large merge but it's all trivial changes, a classic one is you rename a variable that is referenced across the entire system. This is sort of like no one is gonna like you have to spend a lot of time, even if there's 100 changes. It just looks like there's a lot, but it's actually cognitively nothing really complicated going on. So the simpler you can make the overall changes that you are making, the faster the code review will go as well. This is why I argue, as I said, to try to think in terms of work frameworks. If you have these repetitive things in the code that you can safely abstract, so that you don't have to like it becomes sort of a non-thing for you to even think about the problem because it's such a standardized way of working. Then it's also going to be very easy. An example would be, as I said, if you have like styles with variables instead of like updating colors and things like that, or if you make clients like database clients, or like you don't have to rewrite like queries over and over, etc., etc. These are very good investments for you to make. Have a great day.